Hello and welcome to Sounds Heal Podcast. I am your host, Natalie Brown, and thanks so much for joining me as we continue to explore the fields of sound healing, sound therapy, and using sound for health and wellness. This is one of 2 episodes this month for the 2-year anniversary of this podcast series. What a wonderful time it has been, and what an honor to facilitate conversations with such dedicated, fascinating, and passionate people in the field. I thank each of them for their contribution to the sound community. It has been a wonderful learning experience for myself and hopefully for the listeners as well. And I thank all of you for your support of this podcast. Our guest today is Rudi Bach. Rudi performs and teaches sound meditation using a large collection of antique Himalayan bowls. He works with individuals and groups, and we get into a conversation or a perspective that I really appreciate: the personal qualities of a sound worker or sound practitioner. What are we sensing, and what are we listening to in a session? How do we connect with our client or the individual? How do we reflect them? And how do we create trust during the sound sessions? We talk about a lot of different considerations, aesthetics, choices when it comes to which bowls are used, and he shares several stories about different responses people have to sessions. So I really enjoyed this conversation with Rudi, the perspectives he shared, and his openness. This episode is sponsored by the Om Shop and Spa. The Om Shop offers a huge variety of sound healing and vibrational tools for really professionals and those ready to make sound healing, and this vibrational work part of their life for themselves and to help others. They have the country's largest showroom of quartz crystal singing bowls, sound healing instruments, and other vibrational medicine tools. And I've been really lucky to teach workshops there, so I know from experience that they really take the time to get to know their clients, their customers, and really offer help to recommend the tools that would be the right ones for them. Also, if you're in the Sarasota area, it would be great to stop by, check out these tools, but also their luxury spa. They have treatments such as sound healing, energy work, massage, vibroacoustics, hypnotherapy, and they truly offer a holistic experience for practitioners and those seeking healing. So thank you so much to the Om Shop for their sponsorship. Please enjoy this episode with Rudi Bach. Why don't we start first about your background? Of course, we'll get into what you do now with sound, but tell us a little bit about your progression that then led you into sound, but just influences and highlights from your childhood that stick out to you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I grew up in New York City in the 70s, and then I moved to the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts when I was about 8 or so. And while I was in New York, my father befriended an Asian antique dealer named Rudi, who became my godfather. And I think that had a big influence on some of the things that my dad ended up bringing into the house over the years, things that he had gotten from Rudi, and started to collect things after we moved. Rudi was a teacher in the late 60s and early 70s, and my father studied with him. And I remember Rudi coming into the apartment to lead meditations, and he had a tambura, a 4-stringed instrument, and they would do these full moon meditations that I remember as a kid. And Rudi would play this repetitive droning sound, and people would chant to it, or they would go silent, and the drone sound would continue. And I was 4, 5, 6 years old, and people would be sitting in this circle, and um, and that's all they were doing was repeating this sound and repeating this drone. And I think that was probably one of my earliest influences in terms of um, sound as a meditation tool, as a way of nesting into, or sort of slipping into a pocket of sound.
Mm.
And and then also I think it also sort of became a lullaby for me, just being so young at the time. Um, and then years later, my father gave me a bowl.
Mm.
Um, I was in my late 20s, and at the time I really didn't know what to do with it, so I used it for spare change and my car keys, and it sort of sat by the door for a couple of years. And then he called me up and he said, do you still have that bronze bowl I gave you for your birthday years ago? And I said I did. I I think I had laundry quarters in it at the time, and he kind of walked me through what it was and where it was from. And uh, he my dad was sort of a student of philosophy, and a bit of a religious studies scholar, and so a very a pan sort of pan spiritual upbringing. He wasn't a Buddhist. He wasn't following any particular thing, but sort of a la Ken Wilber, he started to really move into that integral approach towards perennial philosophies. And um, and I think that in my studies with Mitch Noor, this notion of um, harmonic sound uh, existing throughout all cultures really grabbed me as something to follow. When I graduated high school, I ended up going to college at UMass in Amherst and got a degree in scenic design for the theater. And I was always interested in sound design, and so you sort of try and do a multidisciplinary approach when studying theater, and then you kind of drop into one thing. So scenic design ended up being my main focus, and then sound design was sort of a secondary interest. Um, and that oddly led me out to Seattle in my early 20s, and I got a gig helping to move a museum from one location to another. They were closing down one old museum and reopening. And so for about 6 months, I was packing art and helping to reinstall it. And that ended up leading to about a 25-year career in art installation and museum exhibition. And the theater design piece kind of slipped in and out of those 25 years. And then at one point, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, I was working on a set, and the producer needed somebody to do some sound design, and I had a reasonable background in it, and so did the sound design for that show, and ended up really following that as well, and I've done sort of more sound design for theater than set design. And somehow I would say these interests in the aesthetic of the visual moment, when you walk into a theater, what you see before the show even starts, and then the things you hear during a show. Sometimes they're very subtle. Of course, the predominant thing being the sound of the voice of the actor, and vocal work has also been very interesting to me. How people use their voice, their tone of voice, um, and so that's sort of interweaved in my theater background. Um, and then the other piece is my father was also a psychotherapist, as was my stepmother and stepbrother, and I took an interest in psychotherapy in my mid 30s. And while living in Seattle, I started studying something called voice dialogue, which is working really with the what you would say is aspects of the personality um, that we all have, parts of us that we get identified with, and then the parts of us that we are disidentified with, and how those parts of us um, can sometimes get out of balance, and we can over-identify with some parts of us, and the disidentified parts can come and really tip over the ship. And so, in sound work, there's an interesting element, which is, how do you allow for the discordant sound to enter, um, and to not always necessarily make it melodic and harmonious, but allow some of those slightly more angled or odd sounds to slip in. And the voice dialogue work is an interesting metaphor for that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I guess I would say that's a reasonable framework for sort of how I got here.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really interesting that um, as a real youngster, I mean, you were introduced to ways to enter a meditative state just through the kind of drone instrument. And I'm curious through what you've kind of just guided us through as your journey. When came the kind of sound meditations that you do now? I understand that you have quite a collection of rare antique instruments. How did that kind of build, and how did sound meditation really become a part of your life and
Mm,
your practice?
mm-hmm. Well, so it started about 11 years ago. I found myself um, in a deep funk, a long, extended, dark night of the soul.
Mm-hmm.
There was somebody that I was seeing, and it didn't work out, and we broke up. And I really traveled inwardly, and I couldn't get out of it for a long time, for about 18 months. I really couldn't see the light of day, and I was sleeping a lot and depressed on every level. And uh, one day, somebody told me about a sound bath that Alexandre Tanu was going to do at Racebrook Lodge uh, in Sheffield, and I didn't know what that was, but they said you should go, and a bell went off, uh, and I mean, I really wasn't going outside. I wasn't seeing anybody. I mean, it was a long 18 months, but something did compel me to go. And so I dragged my sorry hiney over there and laid down with, oh, there must have been about 25 of us or so. And just before I laid down, I looked at his setup, and he had a gong and a few koshi chimes, and maybe 8 or 9 bowls. But I vaguely sort of put together that I had one of those, that my father had given me one, but these were much bigger and darker. Mine was sort of much more cleaned up, and his were more banged up and beat up. And so anyway, I laid down, and for the next hour while he played, I was completely lifted from my depression.
Mm-hmm.
100%. I was within 10 minutes. Shoot, that story had evaporated. The thing that I had been going through just completely dissipated, and I really was moved back in touch with something much more familiar to who I felt I was, and much lighter, much cleaner, like a memory of my better self. And it was really extraordinary. to have something like that, where I was doing nothing therapeutic. I wasn't doing a handstand. I wasn't reliving my childhood. I wasn't writing in a journal. I wasn't doing a mudra. I wasn't fasting. I wasn't doing anything. It was all being done for me, around me, to me. And I sat up and was so taken by how light I felt, and I realized that there was really something there for me. I had been told by my doctor that I should be on antidepressants, and I just for some reason felt like I couldn't do that, and I felt like there was something else. And when this experience happened, I realized I had found it. Um, and then, ironically, or magically, or strangely, when I went out to the parking lot to get in my car, my phone had a text on it from the person that had broken up with me,
Mm-hmm.
and they had left me a text, and I hadn't heard from them in a long time.
Wow.
And the text said, "I miss you. I'm sorry for the way I left."
Wow.
And then I knew there was something. So that was there was something really here for me.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
forgiveness and healing. Yeah.
Well, I imagine that almost launched you into wanting to discover why. I mean, why could something like that uplift you and cleanse you in that way?
Mm,
So, where did it lead you next? What did you find the answer of kind of how that happens and
right.
changes us? Yeah.
Well, I was fortunate in that I lived not far from a fellow who had amassed a small collection of bowls and had a small shop and sold a few, and he and I were friends, so I knew where to go for a few, and I had a few extra bucks, and I started to purchase them, purchased two or three, and just worked with them on my own, placing them, usually just sort of placing them on my body, on my chest in particular, and playing them. And so I faffed around with those for a while and created a small set, um, of maybe, I think, four or six bowls, and started playing them for friends, and working with some friends with them, and just especially friends who were going through something, just helping them settle in. And uh, there was a yoga studio, about, I guess it's now going on 8 years ago, and the woman who ran it was doing a restorative class and knew I had a few bowls, and asked me if I'd like to come and run the shavasana part of the class. And so she would do about a half an hour of restorative yoga, and then I would come in and do 25 minutes or so of bowls. And I really liked what was happening, both with me and just the experience in the room, um, giving people a little, a little carpet ride, a little something to snuggle into as they were going into their resting phase of the session. And so then I picked up a few more, and maybe I had about a dozen or so, and then ended up doing a regular class at this yoga studio in Great Barrington for just under 4 years, a couple sessions a week, um, um, usually with 6 to 8 people, something like that. And then I heard about Mitch's work in Pennsylvania, Nine Ways Academia, and took my first week-long session there. Um, and he really, exposed me to the nature of the work, and how primarily the person playing is the instrument. The bowls are sort of the tool. He did a lot to demystify the instruments, um, which didn't make them less significant, but he definitely took kind of a bit of an iconoclast with the whole Tibetan piece. And and then I then tracked down. It turned out that Alexandre was, did some regular group sessions, and so I went and sat in on his sessions several times and listened to his talks, um, and that sort of led me into just my own study and self-inquiry with them. Um, and then a woman named Jillian Pransky, who's really the godmother of restorative yoga, uh, asked me to do a session for her students at Kripalu. And it was about 90 students. And that was my first exposure to a big group. And I ended up working at Kripalu for about 2.5 years. And those sessions were with large groups between 150 and 200 people. And over the course of my time there, some 5,000 to 6,000 people sat around this collection of bowls that I have now, which is about 35 instruments.
What guides you to which bowl you're going to play? What kind of directs you as far as a particular purpose behind the bowls and why you might choose to play one?
Right. Well, they have come together over the years, and Guy has helped me a great deal, and and just my own interest in music and sound. Um, the pieces, the instruments that I have do have a kind of harmonic relationship to each other. So I would say of the 35 that I play in a session, I think there's give or take something like 5 groupings of about 6 or 7 bowls. And so I'll move from one grouping or set to another. It's improv, for the most part, every time I play. Right now I'm playing about 5 times a week at a resort, a retreat spa in Lenox. And it's very different than Kripalu. Kripalu had a lot of people who meditated and who really had a lot of familiarity with sitting for an hour. That's a little bit much for most civilians. And so I would say that in answer to your question, if I have around me some folks who are more experienced in a sit, I will play a little bit more. Um, I'll probably play a little bit more spare, so longer intervals between strikes, and more space, for the listener. Whereas with somebody who's not as experienced, I might play with a little bit more vigorously, and I might play less intervals to sort of keep their mind occupied, since sometimes people who are sitting for the first time or are not used to sitting, they need to hear a more constant sound, especially for the better part of the beginning of the session, before they're ready to hear more silence. And in terms of what guides me, I guess for me it is more about creating a sound that it creates. I think it's creating a sound that allows the listener to sort of settle into something that they can then move with. I guess what I'm thinking about is how, well, especially at Kripalu, I got a lot of feedback. We would have a feedback at the end of a session. So maybe the sit would be for an hour, and then we take a quick break, and then people would chat for about half an hour afterwards. And so what I got from that was how different the experience is for each person, even if I'm playing the same set. I mean, you could have 150 people listening to the exact same thing that I'm playing, and there'll be 150 different experiences. Um, and So what guides me to the next bowl is a sense of what's happening in the room and what's happening within the instruments on any given night. As people who play these know, especially the antique bowls, um, they're they can sound very differently.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's some consistency in the sound, of course, but they can relate to each other, and they relate to the room, and they relate to what's happening in the room a little differently. Or I'm certainly hearing them a little differently depending on what's happening. If there are 150 people who are very still, there's one thing going on. But if 30 people in that room are a little antsy or a little fidgety, something else is going to be happening in that room. And so um, the session is affected by that, you know.
Yeah, let's unpack that a little bit more from both perspectives, the sound worker and the audience. Within the sound, whether it's the harmonics, the pulsations, or just the acoustics of the room, what are you sensing when you play, and what are you listening to?
Mm. Hmm. Um, well, many times, let's see, there's a couple of things that I'm listening to. It's a great question. So let's think, what could the player be listening to? He can be listening to the room itself and what's going on around the room and within the room. And that can include things like the heating system all of a sudden blowing on because you forgot to turn the thermostat down, and
Mm-hmm.
now you're competing with the sound of the room, or the vacuum cleaner that somebody's using to clean the hallway outside the doors,
Mm-hmm.
or the car, or the people just getting out of a bar down the street. So there's all these sort of external noises, and in the beginning of this work, I found it really challenging to be in a room that had the interruption of external noises. That would throw me, and I would get perturbed and um, have to really kind of battle this inner irritation that was going on, and that took a while to settle down with. And then there's the audience itself, and in a small room or a big room, as you probably know or have heard, especially if people are lying down. Um, a lot of your work can be snore management, and that can be really challenging because people are tired.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've got a somewhat small room that's with 20 people in it, and one, two, or three, or four people are snoring, sometimes the snoring can be louder than the bowls, and so you're kind of working with that. So kind of keeping an eye or listening for what's going on with with people, with the listeners and the participants, with their phones, with their snoring, with their candy wrappers, with all of that, and trying to sense again, like the external noises, how to keep yourself centered with that. So working outwardly, so outside noises, and then the inside the room noises, of participants, and then you're listening. The next round of listening is just your own listening. You're moving around. Did you put on the wrong yoga pants for the session, and you've got slightly crispy sounding pants that sound like sandpaper when they're sliding across from each other, and
Mm-hmm.
now you're irritated at yourself for not wearing your softer yoga pants,
Mm-hmm.
um, to mistakenly um, moving your foot in such a way that it kicks a stick into a bowl, and you had this nice little groove going,
Mm.
and now there's this tinny clang that just happened to interrupt the last 20 minutes of what you did.
Right.
And then you hear this sound of huge disappointment erupting in your throat, um, that you weren't more focused, um, and so there's that, and then you come in and yet one more layer of the listening experience, which is what's going on in your mind, and what are you thinking about? And are you there? Are you being present? Or are you thinking about what's going to happen after class, or how you have to pack up all these bowls and it's going to take an hour and there's snow on the ground and the elevator's not working? And again, kind of losing your sense of presence in the class, um, or hearing something emotional going on, within your heart, and that is keeping you from being present. Um, so there's all these layers of sound that um, can be uh, um, in the way of the very thing that you're there to do, and um, and then there's the sound of the bowls themselves, and um, and in particular, um, and and most powerfully for me is the the space in between the sounds and what happens when the session is over. And for a while, there's just a quiet sit, and the bowls are done. That silent space it can be very profound and very remarkable, at how still it is. When I'm listening to the bowls themselves, when all of that stuff is cleared out, and I'll have to say that it took me a couple of years to get to a place where all of those external sounds, whether it be out on the street or in the room or within myself, it took a couple of years to figure out how to manage myself in the face of all that, so that I could be in the moment more fully. And once I was able to click into that, um, through those layers of irritation and being distracted, really, uh, I was able to get much closer to the craft of this work, which is to really follow the sounds as they go out and around the room, and the way the sound comes back, and developing a closer relationship with each instrument, and how it wants to be played, and with what implement. Because as you know, you can have one bowl and and come up with all kinds of different sounds, depending on what you're playing it with. And so starting to really learn how a certain bowl really responds differently to even a slightly different mallet with a slightly different hardness or wrapping around it. Um, so it became a more intimate listening process, but it took a while. It took a while.
Mm-hmm.
I'm now, the place I work at now, which is still open. It's been open during the pandemic. They actually built a sound pod that can hold maybe about 12 people, and it's lined in cork. It is a separate building from the rest of the main building.
Wow.
And so there's nothing around it, above it, or below it. I have control over the heating system, and that's the only. There's one outlet in this room, and otherwise, there's hardly any right angles. It's been made specifically for acoustic instruments,
Mm-hmm.
and specifically for this kind of vibrational sound therapy. And I'm there 4 days a week, and it's really remarkable to walk into a room that is completely silent. There's nothing. There's
Mm-hmm.
nothing around me. There's nothing above me. I'm not near a road. There's no vacuum cleaners. There's no African drum class below me. There's zero happening. And so the silence is so sweet. It's so remarkable that when people walk into the space, um, it already, like, things are already beginning for them, because of that silence, and also the way I have set up the space. This is sort of where I was able to use my museum and art installation background to create something visually very appealing. Um, so as soon as they walk in, there's something they're seeing that they've never seen before, and they're walking into a space that something subliminally is affecting them, in that there is no audio or sonic distraction going on. And that's very novel for a modern person.
Yeah, I was curious if your art design came in a little bit. Can you describe visually, what you're providing, what somebody might see when they walk in a room
Mm.
like that?
Yeah, so uh, um, I've made and found a series of benches and stands and different all wood things for the bowls to go on. The basic setup is there is a 8 foot round oriental rug, and the benches are curved benches, so they go around the rug in a circular fashion. Um, so it's like a little, and then there's different stands on the benches, on the curved benches,
Mm-hmm.
um, that make the bowls higher or lower. So it's a little like, let's see, it's got a combination of sort of a UFO quality with a kind of layered cake. It's a ring of bowls, and uh, the bowls all have candles in them, so they're internally lit, which is nice in the evening. Um, and there's a real kind of wow factor when you walk in, just because it is so novel and exotic, to see that. And also, there's something about having 35 antique instruments that are 100, 200 years old. Some of them are a little bit older, um, and so because most of them have only been here for the last 10 years or so, the fellow I got them from would go to Kathmandu, would go uh, um, to these collectors and from over there and pick them up. So they still have yak butter in the bottom of them, and some of that Himalayan dust.
Mm-hmm.
And so that cumulative effect, um, of having, let's say, 4,500 years or so in a small space. The bowls are round, the layout is round. This ring, or it's this sort of crown of bowls, this 8 foot crown, if you will. Uh, and because it's the light is coming from inside the bowl, so it feels sort of bejeweled, um, is mesmerizing in its own right, and makes me feel so glad to go to work in this unique office, um, to sit in the middle of this and play. And I think people who do this work recognize that one of the benefits of it is that you are being worked on every time you play.
Right.
And unlike a massage therapist who has to kind of rub their thumbs at the end of a session, you're not getting worn out doing this work, which is pretty amazing. So I enjoy the beauty of it, the aesthetics of it, and the sound of it.
So you have the sound that you're working with, this visual, and then how do you connect with the audience and kind of create the trust of what you're going to do in your sound sessions?
Mm-hmm. Usually in the beginning, well, again, what I've been noticing lately, because of the community that I'm working with, many of them are completely unfamiliar with this practice, whereas Kripalu was much more familiar with it. But either way, usually the first 5 minutes or so are um, uh, just some basic attention to breathing. Um, and lately, I've been asking people to just to pay attention to what's on their mind before we even start. Um, since we mostly live in our mind, that's the person we talk to most as ourselves. So I ask people to, as they settle in and close their eyes, I ask them to check in on what's going on with their mind, seeing what's there without getting too involved with the story, and then using their breath to sort of shift down into the feeling body and take a look at what's happening there. What are you coming in with? What are you working with in the emotional realm? And just sort of observe that. Um, and then we might just do some basic breathing exercises, and then probably come in with some koshi chimes just to start it off, and then go into the session. Um, these days, before we sit, I might ask them a little bit, if it's just one or two people, I might ask them a little bit about what's going on for them without them revealing too much. Just finding out, are they kind of have they been at the resort retreat center for a day or two, or do they just arrive? To what degree are they sort of settled, or are they feeling a little unnerved by a long trip? So just trying to get a sense of where they're at, and then trying to cleanse the palate a little bit in their mental and emotional body through this check-in, which at the end of the session, say 45 or 50 minutes later, I'll have them do the same scan. What's on your mind? Take a moment to look at that. Then what's on your, sort of what's in your heart, or where's your emotional body? So sort of bookending the session with a look. And typically speaking, people will notice that what was on their mind 45 minutes earlier is dust at this point. And similarly, whatever they're holding emotionally, it may not be gone, but there's just more breathing room around it. They're less compressed by the weight of whatever they were working with emotionally. Or if they can't settle into this session and they do find that what's on their mind still dominates, sometimes they'll find that the session allows them to move around the thought, or move around the mental body in a fresh way, and see some different elements that maybe they weren't able to see, because now there's a little bit more space.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say I have as I mentioned, over the years, people have had a lot of different responses to what it was like for them, and they've shared that. And I thought, if you'd like, I could tell you a few things that people have said.
That'd be great. Yeah.
So there was a woman who had hormone and fertility concerns as she was trying to get pregnant. And during the session, she had a vision of holding small children in her arms. There was a woman who spoke of being quite frightened for the whole session, but she felt like she needed to experience the fear. And so she stayed with it until it sort of moved into something less like a tidal wave and just more like, she said, it's like the wave just kept on getting smaller. One woman said that she loved all the sounds except there was one that made her back molar hurt, and she realized she needed to go see a dentist. An elderly woman who said she had had arthritis for about 30 years in both hands, said that during the session the pain went away in her right hand completely, but not her left. And then when the session was over, the pain came back. Many people reported seeing colors and shapes of colors. So those are, synesthesia type folks. Mm-hmm. One woman, she spoke about how she felt like she was growing into a huge giant with masculine energy, and that she was 75 feet tall. And then when the sounds stopped, she retracted back into her body, and it felt cramped and small to be within that body. Wow. This was interesting. There was a woman. So here in New England, in this particular part of New England, we have our indigenous folk are Mohican. Mm-hmm. And there was a woman who pretty early on in the session, I could see she was sitting up and weeping. And afterwards, she shared with the group that her mother had passed away about a year earlier. And she was very heartbroken over the loss of her mom. And that early in the session, with her eyes closed, she saw in her mind's eye a large wolf approaching her. And initially she was frightened, and so she sort of backed up in her imagination to get away from it. And it said to her in her mother's voice, "I'm here for you." And it laid down at her feet. And it turned out that wolf was the family's animal totem. and she had realized that her mom had somehow converged with this wolf in her mind's eye. And so for the next hour during the session, she had this reunion with her mom, and was very, very moved. Now, what I love about that particular session was that right next to her, maybe 2 seats over, there was a woman checking her Instagram account for the entire session, swiping, and she had bangles, around her wrist.
Oh.
Every time she swiped, they would jangle a little bit, and so she could have, she couldn't have cared less about the session.
Wow.
And meanwhile, 6 feet over, there was a woman who really was touching into something deeply moving. Other things are things like, some people feel like they're floating, other people feel like they're being grounded. I had a Japanese husband and wife a couple of weeks ago, and afterwards, it was very broken English. She didn't speak English very well, so she needed her husband's help, but she was able to say that she felt like during the session, it felt like thoughts were trying to come at her head, she said, and but they couldn't get in because she felt like she had and then she couldn't say the words. She only knew it in Japanese, so she said it to her husband, and he said to me in English, force field. She felt like she had a force field around her, keeping the thoughts away from her, which I thought was really interesting and very Japanese too. If you grew up in Japan with anime and all of that, force fields are sort of the thing. And at Kripalu, most of the folks who come, most of the participants are women. 95% of attendees are women, and 5% are men. And most of those guys don't want to be there. They lost a bet with their wife or something like that. And so I had a guy come in. He was in his, I would say, mid to late 60s. He comes into the room. There's a lot of people in there. The bowls are glowing. It's all very beautiful. He looks at me, crosses his arms, and he says to me, so what am I supposed to get out of this? And I'm wearing a Kripalu shirt with my name tag and my drawstrings. And so I'm supposed to say something, to toe the corporate line and respond accordingly about rest and recharging and, maybe your third chakra or something like that. But I knew he wasn't going to get anything from that. So I blurted out, well, you might get nothing out of it, sir. And he goes in and we have the session, and it's we're wrapping up, and I'm standing by the door during the break, and he's starting to walk out, and I look at him and I said, so how was that for you? And he looks at me and he said, nothing happened. And then he winks at me and he says, come here. And he takes me out into the hall where nobody could see him. And he said, I got to tell you what happened. I said, tell me. He said, I'm sitting there and I'm looking around and I'm realizing that there's 150 people around me. And everybody's just still and silent and nobody's moving. And everyone's just got their eyes closed. And he said, he was struggling to find his words. He said, I've never seen anything like that. He said, you weren't trying to entertain us. You weren't performing. There was this stillness, and it was so quiet. He said that part was amazing. And I realized that for him, that was the revelation. Right. Was that we could sit in community silently, nobody reading anything, nothing going on really. Pretty spare experience, and he was really taken by that experience of all of us just being there together, in stillness, in silence. And so that's when I started to really recognize more than ever that you don't know what somebody's going through when they show up with these sessions. You don't know what they're bringing, and what kind of attitude or mood they're in, and what is going to happen to them in that session is really way out of your control. We're, and to do, for me to try and do a session with the purpose of getting somebody to a particular place would I think really have me be getting in the way of where they need to go and what they need to have happen on that particular night.
Right, right. And that's for me, I agree. I mean, that's really kind of where you realize that it is so personal, because when you get that feedback, when people share with you, um, the response is so different for everybody. Um, and that's why the question, what is the sound work? What is sound healing, sound therapy? People almost, they have to experience it for themselves, because it is so uh, versatile. It is so different. And I think the one thing that really is true, what you've said, is, a lot of people, meditation in general is very hard to do. And just, clearing the thoughts, it just isn't something that they can do, or is difficult. But when they have the sound, really a point of focus, and the space in between, that stillness, they find that they are really able to be present with just the sound, and all of a sudden, oh, I don't have any thoughts, or they're open
Mm,
to these other things happening, whether it's
mm,
visions, or colors, or whatever it might be. Yeah.
mm, mm.
Mm-hmm.
There's a piece of that you remind me of, which is the fairly regular response, of feeling like the whole thing took 5 minutes,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And what do you make of that? This notion that a session that lasts 45, 50 minutes, 60 minutes, and people feel like the whole thing was over in 5, maybe 10 at the most. What's your sense of how that happens?
Yeah, I mean, we lose time. I think in a way it must have to do something with our brainwave state slowing down so much. I think it could be, um, and just this sense of presence. I mean, gosh, we're not thinking about all our worries. We're not making our lists for what we have to do next. That there's just this place, this still point where um, there's no concern about time. That's, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, it seems like people are sort of lifted outside of time
Mm-hmm.
for a little bit. They're
Mm-hmm.
sort of lifted outside the river of time,
Mm.
and um, that's a remarkable element of it, I think. And there's something there. Maybe in part, what sound is able to do is um, connect us to to the subtle worlds a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
open us up to the subtle worlds, which again, as modern people, um, we're not trained to do. We just don't have time to be sensitive to the invisible worlds, to these other dimensions that are around us and in us, and somehow sound, not jackhammers, but
Mm-hmm.
well played harmonic sound, that's cared for, um, can be a bit of a portal, um, and people slip into something really quite lovely and good for them.
Mm.
Good for them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, well, it is wonderful that you're able to still provide these services. I know that many people aren't right now. So just kind of bringing it to the present, and what you're able to do with your learning, and all that you're exploring, both in your sessions, and any studying or research you're continuing to do. What part of your work is most important to you right now, and what curiosity is coming forth these days?
Well, as you said, I'm lucky in that I'm able to continue to play,
Mm-hmm.
and have a space and have people come. Um, I've certainly noticed over the last year or so, and even before the pandemic, that um, more people are entering this space pretty agitated,
Mm-hmm.
either in the mental body or in the physical body, and the emotional body, and um, and so I'm really I really care about how those how those two places, the mind and the emotions, what ways can those areas be settled a little bit so that some equilibrium and some homeostasis can show up in the spirit of a person? Because it's very hard to settle down if the mind is just chewing on itself, or the emotional body is overwhelmed. Um, and for me now, sort of making my way towards not quite 10 years, I've noticed that I've I've got a much longer fuse than I ever had. It just takes a lot for me to become irritated at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And and my depression, which I had in my system, I sort of inherited from my family for a long time, has also really lifted starting about 5 years ago. I noticed it really lifted. So the piece around um, finding some methods to create spaciousness and breathing room inside this uh, this physical body and inside um, these these places where we spend a lot of time, which is our mind and our feeling body, creating some spaciousness in there, either with these instruments, or in particular also I notice, again, like after the session is over and we just go into a sit for 5 or 10 minutes, I notice for myself, and I've heard listeners say it as well, that thoughts seem kind of dumb
Mm-hmm.
after a session. Like they seem like a waste of time because it's the same thought you thought like 40 times already that day, or the feeling is just like enough already with feeling this particular feeling, whatever it may be. And so it almost is like the instruments, these bowls, seem to um, uh, like the sound of them is great. I love the harmonics. I love the way the sound plays off of each other, and the unique things that can happen. But it's almost like they're all preparation for the silence at the end of the session, because that's when something really remarkable comes in. And that remarkableness can be, well, I'm okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm okay. And that's a very precious medicine these days, in a world where we often don't feel okay, or we're worried about, ourselves or our loved ones. To feel that sense of okayness is really a blessing, really a blessing. So I guess that's what, as given the times we're living in, I want to try and just continue to live in that by continuing to do this practice, but also be able to bring that as a sort of central function of the work,
Mm-hmm.
and central function of the session.
Right. Yeah, and at a time that just really is so challenging for everyone with the anxieties and the worries, that it really is centered in the mind. I'm just wondering, for people that can't go attend things in person and receive what you're facilitating, any suggestions for something somebody could do at home just to find that spaciousness and find that breathing room?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, there is something about ambient sound work, um, rather than music that has a strong narrative to it. And I love listening to music that has a strong narrative and being sort of taken away um, by all the great musicians and singer songwriters, and the beat and the rhythm of people jamming out. I mean, that's a great way um, to sort of let the day go away, or slip away. But in terms of dropping in and moving inward, there is something about ambient sound, and there's certainly what is that great radio station? Sounds of Space. It's on PBS. It's on NPR.
Right, right. Mm-hmm.
Um, so these sort of more ambient compositions, um, to listen to them, either on headphones or with a decent set of speakers, and try and track the breath a little bit, either with some simple breathing patterns. The 2-4 breath, I think, is really helpful these days. That's the inhale somewhat fully for a count of 2, and then slow the exhale down for a count of 4. And try doing that a few times, in for 2 and out for 4. That seems to sort of downregulate the nervous system a fair amount, and just trying to settle into that breath, and then see where those ambient sounds move you. Now, of course, one of the things that can happen, and this definitely happens for me at times during a session, I can tell that it's actually people start to settle down, and then they start getting nervous because it's the first time in quite a while that they are making room for their feeling body or the anxiety to show up there. And so they're not eating a donut, they're not going to a Netflix, they're not going to all the ways in which we kind of redirect ourselves away from what's actually going on. Mm-hmm. So oddly enough, you could settle down into a nice place with nice music, and all of a sudden you're starting to feel uneasy because your nervous system is starting now to melt a little bit. And so those first layers of relaxation can actually be a little uncomfortable. So getting okay with that discomfort is not easy, because the inclination is, screw this, I'm going to go get some ice cream. So that's tricky.
Yeah, that's really well put. We have our distractions, and actually allowing ourselves to slow down like that. Some things might come up, and just to allow that and surrender to it, so you can get deeper past it. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you don't have a guide there, if you don't have anyone helping you, who can let you know that it's okay what you're feeling right now, because it might be, you might need to feel it for 5, 6, 7 minutes, which can feel like eternity and feel like hell. But you might need to go through a whole layer before you can feel something a little smoother underneath. And if you don't have help with that, that can be challenging. And of course, it seems these days there's lots of guided meditation and mindfulness pieces that can perhaps be helpful if the person whose voice you're listening to, you can click with. And that's really important. There's a lot of people sometimes who will over sugarcoat the session and make it so damn sweet. And what you're feeling is, you need something, it'd be better for you to have a truck driver read it, because you just need something kind of heavy and more blue collar walking you through a session. And so it's really finding the right person to walk you through that is super important.
Yeah, right. That makes sense, because we all resonate with something differently, and one person's approach might be great for me, but not someone else. Yeah.
Well, and really, I think, just circling back to the work you're doing here, it's that tone of voice, and if that tone of voice doesn't work with where you're at, it can really be quite a bother. Whereas if the tone of voice is what you need in that moment, just that tone, let alone what they're guiding you to do or what they're saying, that might not even matter so much. You just feel better listening to that sound of that particular person.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Rudi. Is there anything that we haven't gotten to that you'd like to mention?
Well, no, that feels like we spoke about a lot of things, and I appreciate the way you guided us through that conversation, Natalie.
Perfect. Well, excellent. So nice to get to know you a bit through this, and I really do appreciate your time and all that you're doing. How cool. I want to see this sound pod at your... That sounds amazing.
It's pretty amazing. And
Yeah.
thank you for the work you're doing
Oh,
in
thank you.
spreading the word and keeping this conversation alive for folks. It's no small thing. We appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate you saying that.
You
All
bet.
right. Okay, well,
Thank you.
take care. We'll talk soon.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Sound Heal Podcast, sponsored by the Om Shop and Spa. You can keep up to date with what's coming up next at soundshealstudio.com. Check things out on Facebook at Sounds Heal Studio, and you can listen to all previous podcasts as well as music meditations on the YouTube channel at Sounds Heal Studio. Be well and stay tuned.